Miss Clara Bell waited 3 hours to be seen by the Duke of Belmont. 3 hours standing in a cold marble hall while servants whispered that His Grace disliked being disturbed. 3 hours reminding herself not to lose her temper before the most arrogant man in London. Because Clara had not come to beg for charity. She had come for justice. At last, the doors to the Duke's study opened. And the moment Clara entered, she understood why society tolerated his arrogance so easily. The Duke of Belmont was the sort of man the world forgave too quickly. Young, powerful, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed. Seated behind an enormous mahogany desk as though everyone else existed merely to wait for his attention. Even his silence felt arrogant. Clara barely managed to explain that his late father had destroyed her family before the Duke reached calmly for a document beside him and spoke without looking at her. "If you have finished, Miss Bell, you may leave." The humiliation burned through her instantly. "You have not even heard the truth," Clara replied. Only then did the Duke lift his eyes toward her. Cool. Dismissive. Entirely certain that no woman standing before him could possibly matter enough to challenge him. And with unbearable arrogance, he said, "I do not repeat myself, Miss Bell." That was all. No apology, no interest, no concern for the years her family had suffered while the Duke sat surrounded by wealth built from other people's ruin. Just dismissal. And as Clara stood there fighting humiliation, the arrogant Duke made one terrible mistake. He looked at her as though she would quietly accept it. She did not. Because from that moment forward, Clara Bell made a promise to herself. If the Duke of Belmont believed her voice was unimportant today, then one day, she would make him beg to hear it again. Chapter 1. The Duke Who Would Not Listen. Miss Clara Bell had learned, early and without mercy, that dignity was the one possession no creditor could seize. She had been 17 when the bailiffs came to Ashford Cottage, polite men with cold eyes who catalogued her mother's writing desk, her father's books, and the small portrait of Clara's grandmother that had hung above the parlor fireplace since before Clara was born. They had taken nearly everything. What they could not take was the way Clara stood in the doorway and watched them without flinching. Her mother had wept quietly in the back bedroom. Her younger brother had pressed himself against the wall as though he could disappear into the plaster. But Clara had remained in the doorway with her hands folded and her chin level, because someone in the Bell family had to bear witness, and she had understood even then that collapsing would not restore a single item to its shelf. That was 5 years ago. Since then, Clara had become very good at bearing witness. She had watched her mother take in needlework for ladies who had once called her a friend. She had watched her brother abandon his hopes of university because there was no money for the fees. She had watched Ashford Cottage pass to a merchant family from Norwich who repainted the shutters a colour Clara despised. She had borne all of it with the same composed exterior she had learned in that doorway, not because she felt nothing, but because feeling everything and still standing upright was the only form of power the world had left her. Clara Bell was 22 now. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She was not the kind of young woman society paused to consider. But she possessed something most people underestimated. She remembered everything. She remembered every letter her father had received from Belmont solicitors in the months before his death. She remembered every figure, every clause, every unsigned promise that had collapsed into silence when the late Duke decided the Bell family's ruin was more convenient than their survival. She had kept those letters in a locked box beneath her narrow bed in her aunt's house in Marylebone for 3 years, waiting for the moment when keeping them quietly would matter less than using them. That moment had come. The current Duke of Belmont had returned to London after 2 years managing his estates in the north, and society had greeted his arrival with the reverent attention it reserved for the very powerful and the very indifferent. Clara had no interest in his reception. She had only interest in the appointment she had secured through careful, patient correspondence with his secretary, an appointment she intended to use to its fullest extent, because she had not spent 5 years constructing her composure simply to waste it on timidity. Belmont House stood on the north side of Grosvenor Square, the kind of address that communicated power before a visitor had even reached the front step. The stone facade was immaculate. The iron railings gleamed with fresh black paint. 2 footmen in the Belmont livery flanked the entrance with the particular stillness that expensive households trained into their staff, the stillness that communicated, without a word being spoken, that this was not a house where one arrived and was immediately received. Clara arrived precisely at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October, as her letter had arranged. She was shown inside by a footman who did not meet her eyes and led through an entrance hall of cold white marble to a chair positioned beside a narrow console table as though she were a parcel awaiting collection. The footman informed her, with practiced neutrality, that his Grace would be informed of her arrival. Then he left. Clara sat with her reticule on her lap and her back straight and looked at the ceiling, which was painted with allegorical figures she had no interest in identifying. The hall smelled of beeswax and cut flowers and something faintly metallic, like old stone warmed by inadequate fires. Voices moved distantly behind closed doors. A clock on the console table marked every quarter hour with a soft, considered chime. At 11:15, a different footman appeared to tell her his Grace was presently occupied. At 11:30, a housemaid crossed the far end of the hall without looking at her. At 12 o'clock, no one appeared at all. Clara did not fidget. She did not ask questions. She had anticipated exactly this, the deliberate architecture of waiting, designed to make a visitor feel small before they had spoken a single word. She understood what it meant. It meant the Duke had been told she was here and had chosen not to hurry. She allowed herself one moment of cold, focused anger, pressed it flat, and returned to patience. She had her letters. She had her facts. She had prepared for this conversation with the same thoroughness she had applied to everything for the past 5 years, and she was not going to surrender her composure in a marble hall simply because a powerful man had decided she was not worth punctuality. At 1:30, nearly 3 full hours after her arrival, the doors to the Duke's study were opened by a footman who announced her name without inflection, and Clara rose, smoothed her skirts once, and walked through. The Duke of Belmont did not stand when she entered. He was seated behind an enormous mahogany desk positioned to face the door, which meant he had designed this room to receive visitors exactly as she found him, elevated, central, and entirely unhurried. He was younger than Clara had expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind over years of resentment, and that picture had accumulated the features of his father's legacy: cold, heavy, assured by age and unchallenged power. The actual Duke was perhaps 30, lean, and composed with the specific quality of a man who had never needed to perform composure because it had always come naturally. He was reviewing a document when she entered and finished his sentence before looking up. That detail cost him nothing. It cost her a great deal. Clara stopped at the appropriate distance from his desk, kept her hands still at her sides, and said, "Your Grace. Thank you for receiving me." The Duke set the document aside and looked at her with eyes that were grey and entirely neutral, not hostile, not curious, simply assessing, the way one assessed a letter before deciding whether it warranted a response. "Miss Bell," he said. His voice was low and measured. "I understand you wish to discuss a matter pertaining to my late father's business affairs." "Yes," Clara said. "There are several letters in my possession which document—" "I will stop you there," the Duke said, without raising his voice. "My late father's estate was settled in full 18 months ago. If you are here to present a claim for outstanding debt, you will need to direct your correspondence to my solicitor, whose address my secretary can provide on your way out." Clara felt the dismissal land before she had even finished her first sentence. She held very still. "I am not here to present a debt claim," she said. "I am here because your father used a fraudulent debt claim to destroy mine." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, not surprise exactly, but a slight recalibration, as though she had said something mildly unexpected. He picked up his pen. "The late Duke conducted a great deal of business across many years," he said. "I am not in a position to revisit every transaction he managed." "This was not a transaction," Clara said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and steadied it deliberately. "Your father wrote letters to mine in 1815. He created a false obligation against our property in Hertfordshire and presented it to a solicitor who was in his employ. My father died believing he owed a debt that did not exist. Our property was seized. My family was ruined. I have the letters." The Duke said nothing for a moment. Clara watched him with the full force of the attention she had been saving for 5 years. Then he reached calmly for the document he had been reading when she entered, aligned its edge against the desk, and said, "If you have finished, Miss Bell, you may leave." The humiliation arrived all at once, not loud, not shaking, but precise, like a blade slipped between ribs. "You have not even heard the truth," Clara replied. Only then did the Duke lift his eyes to hers. They were utterly composed, utterly certain. The expression of a man who had been interrupted by inconvenient people before and had never once found the interruption worthwhile. And with the particular arrogance of someone who had never in his life been made to wait for anything, the Duke of Belmont said, "I do not repeat myself, Miss Bell." That was all. No apology. No instruction to his secretary. No acknowledgement that the woman standing before him had spent 5 years assembling evidence that his family had destroyed hers with deliberate and calculated indifference. Just 5 words, delivered in a tone that made it clear the conversation had concluded, and Clara's remaining presence in the room was, at best, a courtesy he was extending on rapidly depleting patience. The door behind her opened. The footman had been listening for exactly this. Clara walked out of Belmont House without looking at the footman, without speaking to the secretary who attempted to hand her a card, and without allowing her pace to change until she had descended the front steps, turned left along the pavement, and passed the corner of the square entirely out of sight of the house. Then she stopped. The October air was cold and damp and tasted of coal smoke and rain, and Clara stood in it for a long moment with her reticule pressed against her ribs and the letters inside it, the same letters the Duke had refused to acknowledge existed, pressing back through the fabric against her fingers. She breathed in. She breathed out. She did not cry, because crying was what he would have expected, and she had no intention of delivering anything the Duke of Belmont expected from her ever again. What she felt was fury, clean, clarifying, and completely without despair, which surprised her slightly. She had spent so long carrying this grievance with the careful, controlled quality of something fragile that she had half expected it to shatter on contact with the man responsible for it. Instead, it had become something harder. Because what the Duke had done in that study was not merely dismiss her. He had looked at her and made a calculation, assessed her youth, her clothing, her lack of connection and rank, and decided that whatever she carried into that room could not possibly matter enough to interrupt the document he was editing. He had not refused to hear her. He had refused to see her. And that, Clara understood with cold precision as she resumed walking through the grey October streets, was the error that would cost him most. She had come to Belmont House hoping for acknowledgement. She had arrived prepared for resistance. What she had not anticipated was being made entirely invisible, and the rage that produced in her was not the shaking, undone kind. It was the kind that settled low and still and began immediately to organize itself into purpose. He had not wanted to hear her once. Very well. She would make London hear her first. Then she would see how long the Duke of Belmont could sustain his magnificent indifference when every ballroom in the city had begun to wonder what Miss Clara Bell knew, and why the Duke looked so very uncomfortable every time she entered one. She would not petition him again. She would not write letters. She would not present herself at his door to be seated in cold marble halls and assigned to the care of footmen who did not meet her eyes. She would do something far more dangerous than argue with him. She would become impossible to ignore. Clara had one advantage the Duke had not considered when he dismissed her so carelessly. She had nothing left to lose. Her family's name was already damaged. Her prospects were already limited. The worst he could have done to her had already been done by his father, and the Sun had simply confirmed this morning that he carried the family's talent for cruelty without any of the inconvenience of guilt. That freedom, the particular freedom of someone who had already survived the worst, was something the powerful rarely understood until it was walking toward them across a ballroom floor in a composed young woman who remembered everything. Clara walked back to Marylebone. She took the letters from her reticule and returned them to their box. She sat at the small writing desk in her aunt's spare room and thought carefully for a very long time. Then she began to plan. Not for justice. Not yet. First, for the Duke's discomfort. And then, slowly, deliberately, in full view of every person in London society who had ever found it convenient to overlook her, for something that would cost him far more than a morning's inconvenience. Clara Bell did not intend to make the Duke of Belmont regret dismissing her. She intended to make him beg to be heard. Hey guys, thank you for 2,000 subscribers. Now I need your help in getting this channel to 3,000 subscribers. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 2. The Woman He Could Not Ignore. Clara's first appearance in London society after her visit to Belmont House was not dramatic. She had considered drama and rejected it, because drama invited sympathy, and sympathy was a currency that devalued quickly. What she needed was not pity. What she needed was presence. She began with Lady Ashmore's dinner on a Thursday evening in early November, accepting the invitation her aunt had received and quietly forgotten, pressing the card smooth and presenting herself at the door in her best evening gown, pale blue silk, 3 seasons out of fashion, but cut well enough that the age of it was not immediately obvious. She arrived neither early nor late. She introduced herself to those she did not know with the composed warmth of a woman entirely at ease in her own company. She laughed at the right moments and listened carefully at all others, and by the end of the first course she had established, without announcing it, that Miss Clara Bell was worth speaking to. This was deliberate. Clara had spent the fortnight since leaving Belmont House making a study of the social landscape the way a general studies terrain, not with enthusiasm, but with the precise attention of someone who understood that every ballroom and dinner table in London was a field on which position could be won or lost by increments. She had no fortune and no title, but she had a quick mind, a composed manner, and an aunt whose connections, though modest, intersected at enough points with fashionable society to provide access where access was needed. She used those connections carefully, accepting every invitation that placed her in rooms where the Duke of Belmont was also expected. She did not arrange to stand near him. She did not engineer introductions. She simply appeared, consistently, gracefully, and always in conversation with someone worth knowing, until her presence in a room stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like an inevitability. By the 3rd week of November she had attended 2 dinners, a card evening at Mrs. Fellows's house in Belgravia, and the first proper ball of the season at Devereux House, and at each one the Duke of Belmont had been present, and at each one Clara had given him nothing more than a brief, civil acknowledgement before turning her attention elsewhere. She watched him register her from across the rooms the way she imagined he registered most inconveniences, with a slight narrowing of attention, a fractional stillness, and then the deliberate return to whatever he had been doing before. Good. He had noticed her. That was enough, for now. The evening that changed the register of things was the Harwood Ball in the 2nd week of December, held in a house large enough that the receiving rooms spilled into one another and the noise of 300 guests created a warm, crowded privacy that Clara had learned to use. She arrived with her aunt, submitted to the receiving line with patient grace, and spent the first half-hour of the evening in conversation with Mr. Gerald Ashby, a pleasant second son with good manners and a genuine interest in agricultural reform that Clara found far more engaging than most of the conversations available to her at such events. They were discussing the enclosure of common land in Hertfordshire, a subject Clara knew from personal and painful experience, when she became aware, without turning to look, that the Duke of Belmont had entered the room. She knew because the room changed slightly, the way rooms changed when someone with significant social gravity arrived, a small reorientation of attention, a subtle shift in the direction of glances. Clara finished her sentence to Mr. Ashby about the inadequacy of current parish relief provisions, noted his impressed expression with quiet satisfaction, and only then allowed herself a brief glance in the Duke's direction. He was speaking with Lord Carrington near the doorway, impeccably dressed and wearing the particular expression of a man who attended these events from obligation and managed them through containment. His eyes moved across the room with the routine survey of someone assessing exits and acquaintances in equal measure, and for 1 second, brief, entirely controlled, they landed on Clara. She looked away first, which was the correct move, and returned to Mr. Ashby. 20 minutes later, she accepted Mr. Ashby's offer of a dance, and they joined the set forming at the far end of the room. She danced well. She knew she danced well, and she did not pretend otherwise to herself. Halfway through the second figure she was aware of the Duke positioned at the room's edge watching the set with an expression she could not fully read from this distance, though she noted it was somewhat less contained than his usual arrangement. When the dance ended, she thanked Mr. Ashby warmly, collected a glass of lemonade from a passing footman, and allowed herself to drift into the orbit of a conversation between Lady Marchmorn and her niece about an improvement recently made to the water supply at a Derbyshire estate. Clara inserted one well-timed observation about land drainage and was admitted into the conversation fully. It was here that the Duke appeared at her elbow. "Miss Bell." His voice was the same as she remembered, low, even, precise. But there was something beneath the evenness tonight that had not been there in the study. Clara turned. "Your Grace." She kept her expression pleasant and entirely uninvested. "I was not aware you had an interest in land drainage," the Duke said. It was not quite a question. Clara considered her answer for exactly as long as she would have considered any answer. "I have an interest in most things that affect property," she said simply. "Particularly property in Hertfordshire." She watched the reference land. His jaw did not tighten. He was too controlled for that. But something behind his eyes recalibrated. "You said you possessed letters," he said, lowering his voice. "If you have documentation you believe is relevant to my father's estate, I believe I explained myself once already, Your Grace," Clara said pleasantly. "I understood at the time that you found a single explanation sufficient." Then she turned back to Lady Marchmorn, who had noticed nothing, and resumed the conversation about drainage as though the most powerful duke in the room were not standing 2 feet behind her absolutely still with what she privately suspected was the first stirring of genuine discomfort he had felt in years. December became January, and January sharpened everything. The season gathered momentum and with it the social engagements multiplied, and Clara moved through them with the same patient, purposeful consistency she had established from the beginning. She danced often, not recklessly, never in a way that exposed her to criticism, but enough to be seen and enough to ensure that the Duke, who appeared at a remarkable number of the same events, observed her being attended to by men whose company society considered worthwhile. She took particular care with Mr. Ashby, whose conversation she genuinely valued and whose obvious admiration she did nothing to discourage, because it was honest and because the Duke watched it with an expression that had begun migrating, in small but unmistakable increments, from neutral to something considerably less comfortable. She did not drop the hints about the Belmont family's history carelessly. She was too precise for carelessness. Instead she distributed them with the selectivity of someone who understood that a question raised in the right company at the right moment could circulate through London society for a fortnight without ever requiring its originator to confirm or deny a single detail. A comment here about the Bell family's unfortunate history with a northern estate. A thoughtful pause there when someone mentioned the late Duke's business reputation, followed by a look that suggested Clara knew more than she was prepared to say in present company. She never lied. She never accused. She simply allowed London to wonder, and London, which had been wondering about the Belmont family's dealings for years without sufficient material to formulate a conclusion, found fresh wondering very agreeable indeed. The Duke found it considerably less agreeable. She first understood how much at the Pelham soirée in the 3rd week of January, where she was deep in conversation with young Lord Fairfax, discussing, of all things, a poetry collection his mother had recommended, when the Duke materialized beside them with the abruptness of a man who had crossed a room faster than he intended to. "Fairfax," he said, with the brief nod of an equal greeting an inferior. Then, to Clara, "I would speak with you, Miss Bell." Lord Fairfax looked between them with the uncertain expression of someone who had inadvertently positioned himself adjacent to something significant. "I am presently engaged, Your Grace," Clara said, with the same pleasant composure she applied to everything. "I see that," the Duke said. His voice was still even, but there was an edge beneath it now that had not been present in December. "Nevertheless." The word landed with the quiet weight of a man accustomed to it being sufficient. Clara looked at him for a moment, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with the measured consideration of someone deciding how much latitude to extend. "Perhaps later in the evening," she said. And then she turned back to Lord Fairfax, who recovered admirably and resumed his point about the collection's treatment of loss, and the Duke stood for one long, extraordinary second before withdrawing. Clara kept her face entirely composed and felt, for the first time since October, something very close to satisfaction. He found her on the landing near the end of the evening, between the supper-room and the staircase, in the brief interval when the crowd thinned and the music from below softened to something distant and manageable. Clara had been expecting it. She had noted the direction of his attention across the supper room and positioned herself accordingly, visible, accessible, and near enough to the staircase that retreat was available if the conversation required ending. The Duke stopped beside her with the bearing of a man who had spent the last several hours navigating toward this moment and had not enjoyed the navigation. "You are doing this deliberately," he said. There was no preamble and no social performance. It was the most direct he had been with her, and Clara respected it even as she declined to reward it. "I attend the events to which I am invited, Your Grace," she said. "I converse with the people I find agreeable. I fail to understand what deliberateness you are attributing to me." "The comments about my father's business affairs," he said. "The implication that you possess information damaging to the Belmont name." "I implied nothing," Clara said precisely. "I possess information. Whether it damages the Belmont name depends entirely on what the Belmont name has done, which I would think you best placed to assess." He looked at her then with an intensity she had not encountered from him before, not the cool assessment of the study which had looked through her, but something more direct and more unsettled, as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time and finding the view considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. "What is it you want, Miss Bell?" Clara held his gaze without difficulty. She had rehearsed her answer to this question, not because she needed to rehearse it but because the wording mattered and she intended to deliver it without a syllable wasted. "What I want, Your Grace, is what I came to Belmont House to ask for in October," she said. "An honest hearing. An acknowledgment of what your father did to mine. And a conversation conducted between two people of equal dignity, rather than between a duke and an inconvenience he prefers not to schedule." Something moved across his face that she could not entirely name. Not quite guilt. Not quite anger. Something between the two that suggested she had located, without fully intending to, something he had not expected her to reach. "You said I had not heard you," he said, and his voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge without becoming soft. "Then perhaps," Clara said, "you ought to ask properly." She let that stand for exactly as long as it needed to stand. Then she inclined her head with the grace of a woman who had just conducted the most important exchange of her season, descended the first 3 stairs, and paused once without turning. "Good evening, Your Grace." She did not look back. She did not need to. Because the Duke of Belmont, the man who did not repeat himself, the man who had dismissed her with 5 words and returned to his document, was still standing on the landing above her, and from the quality of the silence he left behind, Clara understood that he was not thinking about the document anymore. He was thinking about her. And that, she thought as she descended the remaining stairs into the warmth and noise of the crowd below, was precisely where she needed him to be. Chapter 3. The Truth Beneath the Pride. The Duke of Belmont did not, as a rule, conduct his own investigations. He had solicitors for legal matters, a steward for estate affairs, and a secretary whose principal value lay in his ability to locate documents without being asked twice. But the matter of Miss Clara Bell presented a particular difficulty, which was that he could not instruct anyone in his employ to look into her claims without first acknowledging that her claims might be worth looking into, and he was not yet prepared to make that acknowledgment to anyone but himself. So he did it alone. He began the evening after the Pelham soirée, when the house was quiet and the rational explanation he had been constructing for Clara's behavior, that she was a clever young woman pursuing a fraudulent grievance with unusual composure, had developed, in the silence of his study, an uncomfortable number of gaps. He pulled the correspondence files from his late father's estate settlement himself, carrying 3 years' worth of archived documents from the records room to his desk without summoning a footman, and began reading by lamplight with the methodical attention he applied to everything that required it. The first file told him nothing. The second contained the beginning of something. By the third, a collection of letters exchanged between his father's personal solicitor and a Mr. Aldous Crane of Gray's Inn in the autumn of 1815, the Duke had stopped reading with detachment and started reading with the focused, unpleasant attention of a man who has found something he would have preferred not to find. The letters were careful. His father had been too intelligent for crudeness, and the language throughout was constructed with the deliberate ambiguity of men who understood that written records outlasted intentions. But the architecture of what had been done was visible beneath the careful language once one knew what to look for, and the Duke, who had managed his own considerable estates for 6 years without once allowing sentiment to obscure a figure, knew precisely what to look for. A property in Hertfordshire, Bell's Ashford, the records named it, had been secured against a debt obligation in October 1815. The obligation had been created using a promissory note that Crane had drawn up, and the late Duke had apparently arranged to have presented to Mr. Edward Bell as a legitimate claim dating from a business arrangement 3 years prior. There was no record of the original arrangement. There was no record because the Duke understood with cold certainty as he read Crane's careful, oblique letter of confirmation, there had been no original arrangement. The debt was manufactured. The property had been seized 4 months later, in February 1816, when Mr. Bell defaulted on the obligation. Edward Bell had died of a fever the following spring, which the Duke's father had noted in a brief postscript to a letter about an entirely unrelated matter in terms so indifferent they made the current Duke set the page down and sit very still for a long moment. He already understood why his father had done it. The Ashford property in Hertfordshire sat adjacent to a parcel of Belmont land that his father had been attempting to consolidate for years, land that, once joined to the Bell property, completed a stretch of agricultural estate worth considerably more unified than divided. His father had wanted the land. A fraudulent debt had been the cheapest method of acquiring it. The Bell family had been ruined to save the duchy the cost of a fair purchase price. The Duke sat at his desk until the fire burned low and the lamplight began to flatten, and he thought about 5 words he had spoken in this same room in October, and about the woman who had received them standing at exactly the distance she stood now only in his memory, composed and furious and entirely right, while he had reached for a document and told her to leave. He did not sleep well that night. He did not sleep well for several nights following. He had not intended to seek her out. He had intended, with the careful restraint he applied to all impulses that risked complicating his position, to proceed methodically, to consult his solicitor about the legal implications, to assess what remedy was possible, and to communicate with Miss Bell through the appropriate formal channels once he had determined what could be offered. This plan lasted until the afternoon of the following Thursday, when he arrived at Lady Thornfield's winter musicale purely from social obligation and found Clara seated in the 3rd row beside her aunt, listening to a young soprano with the attentive stillness of someone who genuinely appreciated music rather than attended it. He did not approach her during the performance. He found a position near the back of the room and watched her instead, which was not something he had planned and not something he would have admitted to planning. She sat very straight. She applauded with genuine warmth. She leaned once toward her aunt to murmur something that made the older woman smile, and the brief animation that crossed her own face in that moment was so entirely unguarded that the Duke looked away from it as though he had seen something he was not entitled to observe. During the interval, when the guests dispersed into the adjoining salon for refreshments, he found himself moving toward her before the decision had fully formed. Miss Bell. She turned from the refreshment table with a cup of tea in her hand and met his eyes with the composed neutrality she deployed for him reliably and, he had begun to suspect, with some effort. "Your Grace. I wonder if I might speak with you," he said. The phrasing was deliberate. He watched her register it, the absence of the imperative, the presence of a question, and something in her expression shifted by one careful degree. She set her cup on the table and glanced at her aunt, who had become conveniently absorbed in conversation with a neighbor. "Very well," she said. They moved to the window at the room's far end, where the winter light fell grey and flat across the curtains and the sound of the other guests receded to a manageable distance. The Duke had prepared language for this. He had been constructing careful, measured sentences for 3 days. What came out instead was considerably more direct. "Your father's name was Edward Bell," he said. "The Ashford property in Hertfordshire was taken from your family in February of 1816 on the basis of a debt obligation created the previous October by a solicitor named Aldous Crane at my father's instruction. The debt was not legitimate." Clara said nothing. Her expression did not collapse or brighten. It held steady with an effort that was visible only in the slight stillness of her hands. "I have read the letters," he said. "I found them in the estate files. I understand what was done." The silence between them lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Clara said, very quietly, "My father spent the last months of his life believing he had failed us through his own negligence. He died thinking the debt was real." The Duke held her gaze. There was nothing adequate to say to that, and he was honest enough not to attempt adequacy. "I know," he said. Clara looked at him for another moment with an expression he could not fully interpret, something between relief and grief and a wariness that had not diminished, and then said, with the precision of someone releasing a weight they have carried for a very long time, "He was not negligent. He was careful and honest, and he trusted a letter that came with the Belmont seal, and it destroyed everything he had spent his life building." She did not stop there. It was the first time she had been given genuine space to speak, and she used it with the composed directness he had come to expect from her, though the content of what followed cost her more than her expression revealed. She told him about her mother, a woman of modest but real gentility who had been reduced, after the seizure of the property, to accepting work that her social position made humiliating. The needlework. The teaching of pianoforte to tradesmen's daughters in the back parlor of her sister's house. The steady erosion of everything she had been raised to expect her life to contain. She told him about her brother Thomas, who was 23 now and working as a clerk in a shipping office in Bristol because the opportunity his father's modest estate would have funded had been made impossible. She told him about the practical shape of ruin, not the dramatic version that society discussed in drawing rooms, but the slow, administrative version. The letters that stopped coming, the invitations that were quietly withdrawn, the acquaintances who found it convenient not to remember that they had known the Bell family when circumstances had been different. She told him about the shame, and this was the part that cost her most, visible in the single moment where her composure thinned and she paused and rebuilt it before continuing. The shame of knowing the ruin was not earned. The particular cruelty of being held responsible by implication for something done to you deliberately. The way it had attached itself to every introduction she had made in the past 5 years, every room she had entered, every conversation where someone had looked at her family name and calculated its damage. She had carried all of it without assistance, without acknowledgement, and without a single person in a position to remedy it ever once having asked her to explain. "You were the first person of consequence I asked," she said. "And you told me you did not repeat yourself." The Duke did not look away from that. He accepted it in the same way he had accepted the documents, fully, without the comfort of qualification. "Yes," he said. "I did." What followed was not simple. The Duke did not make the mistake of believing that knowing the truth created an immediate obligation on Clara's part, and she gave him no indication that it did. But something between them altered after the musicale, not warmly, not quickly, but in the way that things alter when a fundamental dishonesty has been removed and both parties must reckon with what remains without it. He began appearing at her side at social gatherings in ways that were protective without being possessive. When Mr. Denholm, a florid, self-important man of 50 with a talent for pointed remarks about family histories, positioned himself near Clara at the Cavendish dinner and began a line of inquiry about the Bell estate with the relish of someone who had been saving it, the Duke arrived at Clara's shoulder with the particular quality of presence that closed conversations without a word being spoken. Denholm assessed the situation, found the Duke's expression entirely unyielding, and discovered a sudden interest in the other end of the table. Clara noticed. She thanked the Duke with a brief, civil nod and said nothing further, which was her right, and which he accepted without comment. There were other moments. At the Gresham ball he intercepted a piece of gossip circulating about the Bell family's finances before it reached the corner of the room where Clara was standing, redirecting it with a single authoritative statement about the unreliability of its source that effectively killed it. He did not tell her he had done this. He found that he preferred she not know, which was a new preference and one he did not fully examine. She noticed anyway. Clara noticed most things. "You spoke to Lady Gresham about the rumor," she said, finding him near the cardroom door toward the end of the evening. It was not phrased as a question. "Lady Gresham is easily influenced by a confident correction," he said. "The rumor was false." "I am aware it was false," Clara said. There was a precision in her voice that was not quite gratitude and not quite warning. "I have been managing false rumors for 5 years without assistance, Your Grace." "I am aware of that also," he said. She studied him with the full weight of her attention, which he had come to find more disconcerting than any social challenge he encountered. "Why?" she said. "Because the rumors are false and you have been harmed enough," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised even him. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, carefully, "Guilt is not the same thing as care." It was the most honest thing she had said to him directly, and it landed precisely where she intended. "I know the difference," he said. "Do you?" she said. Not unkindly, but with the steadiness of a woman who had been offered things before that looked like care and turned out to be convenience, and who had learned to require more than appearances before she revised her assessment. She moved away before he could answer, and the Duke stood where she left him and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has been told something true in a form he cannot argue with, that she was not wrong to require proof he had not yet provided. The Alderton Ball was the largest event of the February season, held in a house grand enough to accommodate 400 guests across 3 connected rooms, with dancing in the principal room and enough ambient noise that conversations conducted at the room's perimeter achieved a reasonable privacy. Clara arrived knowing the Duke would be present. She had spent the preceding week aware of a shift in the quality of her own feelings that she found inconvenient and refused to examine directly, because examining it directly would require admitting that the man she had spent 4 months carefully tormenting had become, somewhere in the process, a man she thought about when he was not present. She did not intend to admit this. Instead she arrived with her aunt, danced twice with Mr. Ashby, and spent the early part of the evening in excellent conversation with Lady Thornfield about the management of a charitable reading room the older woman was establishing in Southwark. She was composed and engaged and entirely present in every conversation she conducted, and if the edge of her awareness tracked the Duke's position across the room with a consistency that had become involuntary, she gave it no external expression. The Duke, for his part, had been watching her for most of the evening with an attention that had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. His conversations were maintained with the surface competence of long social training, while something beneath the surface had stopped cooperating with the performance entirely. At 10:30 he crossed the room toward her with a directness that Lady Thornfield observed with undisguised interest before finding a reason to withdraw. "Miss Bell," he said, "would you honor me with the next dance?" It was correct in form. It was the proper ask. Clara looked at him. She thought about the musicale and the Gresham Ball and the conversation near the cardroom door. She thought about guilt and care and the difference between them, which she had named precisely because she needed him to understand she could see both and would not confuse them. She thought about her mother's parlor and her brother's clerk's salary and her father dying believing he had failed. And then, before she had fully decided to do it, she said, "I am afraid I am engaged for the next set, Your Grace." The Duke went very still. It was not a refusal he had anticipated, not here, not after the preceding weeks, and the stillness lasted long enough that the people nearest them became aware of something unresolved passing between two people who were very carefully not showing it. "I see," he said. His voice was even. His eyes were not. Then perhaps another. "I do not think so," Clara said. "Not this evening." She held his gaze with the full steadiness she possessed, and she made herself maintain it even as something in his expression, beneath the control, beneath the pride, in the part of him that had read those letters alone by lamplight and had not slept, showed her something raw and entirely unperformed. "Miss Bell," he said, quietly. Just her name. Just that. Clara felt the pull of it and stood against it with everything she had, because she had not spent 5 years building herself into someone who could not be dismissed only to undo it in a ballroom by accepting too little too soon. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. She turned and walked back toward her aunt, and she kept her pace even and her posture straight and her hands entirely still, and she did not look back, because looking back would have shown him what she was not yet ready for him to see. Behind her, the Duke of Belmont stood in the middle of the Alderton ballroom surrounded by 400 people and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific and humbling sensation of wanting something he could not simply decide to have. It was not comfortable. It was not familiar. But it was, he understood as he stood there with the noise of the ball pressing around him and Clara's straight back disappearing into the crowd, completely and irreversibly real. Chapter 4. So she made him beg. Clara did not go back to the dancing. She had intended to, had fully planned to return to her aunt's side and resume the evening with the same composed steadiness she had maintained for months, but the moment she cleared the edge of the crowd and found herself in the cooler air of the corridor leading toward the terrace, she kept walking. Not from distress. She was precise enough about her own interior to know the difference between retreat and necessity, and what she needed in this moment was 30 seconds of silence in which she could set down the weight of what had just passed between them and determine whether it had changed anything she was not prepared to have changed. The terrace corridor was narrow and lit by 2 wall sconces that cast a warm, insufficient light across the pale paneling. The noise of the ball receded behind her to something muffled and distant, and the cold coming through the terrace doors at the corridor's end was a relief after the heat of 400 assembled guests. Clara stopped near the middle of the corridor, turned toward the dark glass of the terrace doors, and looked at her own reflection, composed, upright, entirely legible to herself if to no one else, and breathed. She had not been wrong to refuse him. She believed that with the same certainty she believed everything she had done since October, every calculated step across every ballroom, every carefully placed silence, every conversation with Mr. Ashby she had allowed to be observed. She had not been wrong. But standing against the pull of what she had seen in his face when she said no, that unguarded, unperformed moment that had lasted less than 2 seconds and had cost him something real, was harder than she had expected, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that it was harder because she had not expected to care. She had expected to feel satisfaction. She had planned for satisfaction. What she felt instead was considerably more complicated, and she was in the middle of examining it with the careful attention it deserved when she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. She knew before she turned. The quality of the step, deliberate, unhurried, too controlled to be entirely controlled, was one she had catalogued across 4 months of ballrooms and drawing rooms and one poorly lit landing in a house in Mayfair, and she recognized it the way one recognizes a voice in a crowded room. She turned. The Duke of Belmont stood at the corridor's entrance. He had followed her. He had left the ballroom, crossed the crowd, and followed her into a private corridor, and the fact of it was so entirely contrary to everything she knew of his character, his composure, his containment, his lifelong commitment to never pursuing anything that required visible effort, that for one moment Clara simply looked at him. He looked different here. Not diminished, nothing about him was diminished, but stripped of the social architecture that the ballroom provided. There were no audiences to manage here, no conversations to maintain, no rank to perform. There was only the corridor and the insufficient light and the Duke standing in it with his composure present but visibly costing him something, his grey eyes on her face with an intensity that had moved entirely beyond the register of social interaction. He said nothing immediately. He crossed the corridor until he stood at a distance that was closer than propriety strictly recommended and further than comfort currently permitted, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a destination he had not known he was moving toward until he was already there. "You should return to the ballroom," Clara said. It was not unkind. It was the last responsible thing she could think to offer him, and she offered it honestly. "Yes," the Duke said. He did not move. What followed was not the speech he would have prepared, had he been the kind of man who prepared speeches. He was not. He had spent his adult life in the knowledge that words, chosen carefully and deployed sparingly, were more powerful than any volume of them, and he had governed himself accordingly, had said less than he felt in every situation that mattered, because controlling the expression of feeling had always seemed preferable to the exposure that came with releasing it. He understood now, standing in this corridor with Clara looking at him with the steady, assessing attention that had undone him incrementally across 4 months, that this preference had been the central error of his character, and that he had arrived at the moment where it would cost him everything or be abandoned entirely. "I owe you more than an investigation," he said. His voice was low. The evenness was still present but carried differently now, without the distance that had always accompanied it. "I owe you the acknowledgment I refused in October, when I had not read the letters and had not yet understood what I was dismissing. You came to me with the truth and I turned you away because I was certain that a woman with no title and no connection and no appointment scheduled could not possibly be carrying anything I needed to hear. I was wrong. I have been wrong about a great many things." Clara said nothing. She was listening with the full attention she gave everything, and she did not help him, which was correct of her and which made it harder and which he deserved. "I have watched you," he said, "across every room, every evening, for 4 months. I told myself I was watching because you were a complication I needed to manage. That lasted approximately 3 weeks." Something moved in her expression. She controlled it, but he saw it. He continued. I told myself next that I was watching because I felt responsible for what my father had done. That was partially true and mostly convenient, and I knew the difference and chose the convenient version because the true version required admitting something I was not prepared to admit in November. He paused. Not for effect. He paused because what came next was the part he had no practiced language for, and finding unpracticed language in front of the one person he most needed to understand it precisely was the most exposed he had felt since he was a boy being told his mother would not recover. I was watching you because I could not stop, he said. Because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in any room in any season, and because every time you walked away from me I felt it in a way I have no dignified language for, and because standing in that ballroom watching you refuse me with your back straight and your hands still and your face composed, I understood that I would rather be refused by you than accepted by anyone else alive. Clara's expression had shifted. He could see it and could not fully read it, which was its own form of unbearable. I am not asking you to forgive my father, he said. His actions were deliberate and the harm was real, and I have no right to request that you diminish it for my comfort. I am not asking you to forgive me for October, though I require your forgiveness for it more than I have required anything. I am asking, he stopped. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he had been containing since November, since the musicale, since the landing at the Pelham soirée, since the evening in his study when he had read the letters by lamplight and understood what manner of man his father had been and what manner of man he himself had nearly remained. I am asking you to stop looking at me as though I am only what he made me, he said. I am asking you to believe that every feeling I have shown you, however poorly and however late, is real and entirely my own. I am asking you to let me spend however long it takes proving it, in whatever terms you require, without rank, without the duchy, without anything except the plain and unadorned fact that I love you and I cannot conceive of a life lived in the direction away from you. His voice, at the end, was not the voice of the Duke of Belmont. It was the voice of a man speaking without armor for the first time, and the rawness of it was complete. Punish my pride if you must, Clara, he said, and her name in his mouth without the miss, without the formal distance, was its own form of declaration. Despise me for what my family did. But do not ask me to live without you. I cannot. The corridor was entirely silent. Outside the terrace doors the winter dark pressed against the glass, and behind them the distant music of the ball moved through the walls like something happening in another world entirely. Clara looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was in the process of understanding completely, with patience and precision and without the safety of pretending she did not feel what she felt. She had planned for a great many things. She had planned for his pursuit and his jealousy and his investigation and his guilt. She had planned for the confession, because she had known it was coming, had seen it assembling itself across weeks of small unguarded moments, and she had told herself she would receive it with the same composed assessment she applied to everything. She had not planned for the rawness of it. She had not planned for the way he said her name. Clara took one breath and made the only decision she had ever made in her life without first preparing for its consequences. I want to show you something, she said. She opened her reticule. She had carried the letters every evening for 4 months, not from sentimentality, but because a woman conducting the campaign she had been conducting did not leave her primary evidence at home, and she drew out now not the full correspondence but a single folded page, worn at the creases from years of handling, and held it out toward him. He took it. He unfolded it in the corridor's poor light and read it, and she watched his face while he did. It was her father's last letter. Not to the Duke, not to a solicitor, not to anyone engaged in the formal machinery of the ruin, but to Clara herself, written 3 weeks before Edward Bell died, when he had understood that the debt would not be recovered and the property would not be returned, and the family he had spent his life building a foundation for was standing on ground that had been deliberately removed beneath them. He had written it in the careful hand of a man who knew he was leaving and wanted to leave something behind that money could not make and creditors could not seize. He had told her she was the steadiest person he had ever known. He had told her that whatever the world did to the Bell name, it could not touch what she was. He had told her that he was sorry, not for failing, because he had not failed, but for the years she would spend carrying what he could not fix before he left. He had told her to find her own happiness eventually, when justice was finished with her, because she deserved a life that was more than a war for what was right. The Duke read it to the end. Then he folded it with the same care she had used for 5 years and returned it to her without speaking, and when Clara looked at his face she found something she had not expected to find there, not guilt, not the managed remorse of a man discharging an obligation, but grief. Simple, genuine grief for a man he had never known and a wrong he had inherited without choosing it and could not now undo. He knew she was right, Clara said, and her voice was quieter now than it had been all evening, stripped to the register she used only when she was not performing anything at all. He knew the debt was wrong. He spent the last weeks of his life trying to trace how it had been constructed, and he could not find the documents because your father's solicitor had them, and he died without ever being able to prove it. I have spent 5 years proving it for him. She looked at the Duke steadily. I do not want revenge anymore, she said. I want his name restored. I want my mother's years of needlework acknowledged as unnecessary suffering. I want my brother's future returned to him. These are the things I came to Belmont House to ask for, before you told me you did not repeat yourself. You will have them, the Duke said immediately. Not as a bargaining position. Not as an offer subject to qualification. Simply as a fact he was stating in the same register she had used, stripped of performance. All of them. The property, the Bell name, formal documentation of what was done and by whom, and whatever legal remedy my solicitor can construct that addresses your brother's losses. You will have them regardless of everything else you choose. Clara looked at him. Here was the place where she had always known the story would arrive, the place she had been walking toward since October, and she understood now that it felt nothing like she had expected. She had expected to feel vindicated. She had expected the cold satisfaction of a plan completed and a proud man humbled before her. What she felt instead was something warmer and considerably more frightening, which was the recognition that the man standing in front of her, the man who had found the letters alone by lamplight, who had intervened at the Gresham ball without telling her, who had just spoken her name in a voice that had cost him the last of his considerable armor, was not performing anything. He was simply present. Entirely, vulnerably, irrevocably present. And she was tired of standing at a distance from that. You told me you do not repeat yourself, she said. He held her gaze. I was wrong about that also, he said. I will say whatever requires saying as many times as necessary for however long you require it. I will repeat myself indefinitely, Clara, if you will permit me the chance. She permitted herself, for the first time since October, to feel the full force of what she felt for him, not the controlled, useful version she had deployed to drive the campaign, but the real version underneath it, which had been building since the Pelham landing and the musicale and every subsequent moment in which she had seen the man beneath the Duke and found him worth the knowing. You may begin, she said, by asking me to dance. Properly. Tomorrow evening at the Whitmore reception. And if I ask properly, he said. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, not hope exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has been out in the cold for a very long time and has just been shown a lighted window. Then I will answer properly, Clara said. For the first time. She held out her hand. He took it, not to lead her anywhere, simply to hold, in the narrow corridor with the winter dark at the glass and the distant music moving through the walls, a gesture so quiet after everything that had preceded it that its significance resided entirely in what it cost him to make it without pride and what it cost her to receive it without conditions. It was enough. It was, she thought, the most honest thing they had done. The Whitmore reception was the last event of the February season, and by the time it concluded, London had observed something that would generate conversation through the spring and well into the summer. The Duke of Belmont dancing twice with Miss Clara Bell, requesting the second set before the first had finished, and conducting himself throughout the evening with the focused attention of a man who had ceased to be interested in any other point in the room. Those who had followed the story across the season, and most of London had followed it, in the way London followed anything with sufficiently dramatic tension, revised their various interpretations rapidly. What had begun as an unlikely social rivalry between a duke and a young woman of no particular consequence had become, in the space of a single Alderton ball and its aftermath, something the city recognized instinctively as the real article. Society's formal acknowledgment came 3 weeks later, when the Duke of Belmont called upon Miss Bell at her aunt's house in Marylebone and was received in the front parlour, which was a small room with modest furnishings and a window that looked onto the street rather than a garden, and which the Duke entered without appearing to register any of this. He sat across from Clara in a chair that was slightly too small for him and asked her, with the directness she had taught him to value, whether she would consider his proposal of marriage and what conditions she required before she would answer. She had 3. The first was the legal restoration of her father's name, to be completed in full with formal documentation before any engagement was announced. The second was a proper settlement for her brother Thomas, not charity, but the restitution of what had been taken, structured as his own to use as he chose. The third was that the Duke, should she accept him, would never again dismiss another person from that study on the assumption that what they carried was not worth his time. He agreed to all 3 without negotiation, which was not what she had expected. "You prepared for argument," he said, reading her expression with the accuracy he had developed across months of paying close attention. "I prepared for reasonable discussion," Clara corrected. "You may consider this reasonable discussion concluded," he said. The legal process moved with the efficiency that significant ducal attention and an excellent solicitor could produce. The Bell family debt was formally declared fraudulent in the 4th week of March, the documentation filed with the appropriate courts and copied to the Bell family's own legal representative, a young solicitor engaged at the Duke's expense. The Ashford property in Hertfordshire had passed through 2 subsequent owners and could not be physically returned, but the Duke purchased its equivalent in land and value and transferred it to Thomas Bell outright, with a letter of explanation written in his own hand that Thomas read twice and then carried in his coat pocket for a month, because he was 23 and had grown up in the shadow of a wrong he had never understood how to name. Clara received a copy of the legal documentation on a Tuesday morning and sat with it at the writing desk in her aunt's spare room, the same desk where she had sat in October and planned a campaign she had believed would end in justice and had not imagined might also end in love, and allowed herself, in private and at last, to feel the full weight of everything she had carried and set down. She gave herself precisely as long as it required. Then she washed her face, changed her dress, and wrote a letter to the Duke accepting his proposal. They were married in June, at a church in Mayfair on a clear morning that gave the city the particular quality of light it produced only in early summer, golden, unhurried, and entirely indifferent to the significance of events occurring beneath it. The ceremony was attended by Thomas Bell, who stood in the front pew with the upright bearing of a young man reconstructing himself from new materials and managing it admirably. Clara's mother sat beside him in a gown she had not made herself for the first time in 5 years, and the expression on her face throughout the service was not the polished social expression of a woman performing happiness at an appropriate occasion, but the real version, quiet and full and slightly disbelieving, the expression of someone who has been returned something they had stopped expecting to see again. The Duke, who had managed his composure through every social occasion of the preceding decade with the flawless control of a man who had learned early that showing feeling was a form of weakness, did not manage it perfectly when Clara arrived at the church. He managed it adequately, which was all that was necessary, and which Clara observed from the aisle with a private warmth she did not entirely conceal. Afterward, standing beside him on the church steps with the June light on the stone and Thomas laughing at something their mother had said and the small gathered crowd offering its congratulations, Clara looked at the man she had come to Belmont House to confront 9 months ago and thought about what she had intended then versus what she had arrived at now. She had intended justice. She had intended the specific satisfaction of forcing a proud man to acknowledge what he had refused to hear. She had gotten both of those things. What she had not intended, and what she had received in addition, was the discovery that the arrogant Duke of Belmont, the man who did not repeat himself, the man who had dismissed her with 5 words and returned to his document, was, beneath the pride and the composure and the cold inherited architecture of his position, a man worth knowing. Worth fighting. Worth forgiving. He looked at her then, as though he felt her looking, and the expression on his face was not the contained neutrality she had catalogued in October, nor the managed discomfort of November, nor even the raw vulnerability of the terrace corridor. It was simpler than all of those. He was simply glad. And so was she. Clara Bell, who had stood in a cold marble hall for 3 hours and been dismissed with 5 words and had decided in the space of a single humiliated moment that she would not quietly accept it, who had walked out of Belmont House in October with her letters pressed to her ribs and her fury organized into purpose, stood on the church steps in June as the Duchess of Belmont and understood that revenge had never been what she wanted. What she had wanted was to be seen. and the man beside her had been looking at nothing else for months. Thanks for listening to the end. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. There's another one waiting for you on the screen. Click it, keep listening, and stay in this world a little longer. And if you haven't already, drop a like, share, and subscribe. We're on the way to 3,000 subscribers. Be part of it.